The story starts off with our heroine, who had just bare witness to her lover and her trusted maid in the throes of passion. Her lover, or soon-to-be ex-lover, promised Melissa the world, for once he married Yulia, he promised to expel her from the family, and Melissa would take her place as the lady of the Maquis family. Yulia, daughter of the Rapier family, one of the most prestigious noble families in the empire, had always been alone. Her father paid no attention to Yulia, for he cared deeply about her sick mother, who had been born quite frail. And because of this, she'd spent many days alone in their large, luxurious greenhouse. But that soon changed when she met a little boy in that greenhouse. The boy's name was Giselle Mordo, who would later bring much happiness into Yulia's life. And he had been the sole reason for the happiness in her life. That is, until 10 minutes ago. Now she stood devastated in the midst of their betrayal. And 1 week later, she sat, frustrated and infuriated that Giselle, an illegitimate child of the Mordo family, a barren family, would dare to deceive her in such a way. She'd loved him regardless of his standing in the Mordo family. She'd also provided limitless support to him for the last 10 years. A voice drew her out of her rageful thoughts, and she turned to the nanny as she approached Yulia, a frown marring her features. She hugged her nanny for comfort, as if to ward off her burdensome thoughts. She promised not to worry her anymore, but soon another voice called out her name. And it was the voice of a snake in her presence. Melissa stood before her, and she informed Yulia that Giselle would soon be arriving at the estate before she inquired if she should call a physician. Her face the picture of worry, which Yulia knew now to be nothing but a vicious mask. She recalled the first time she'd met Melissa Jean, a commoner girl that Giselle had brought in years ago, and she'd allowed this girl to become her maid, which under normal circumstances wouldn't have happened because of her background. She'd treated Melissa like a sister, just as she'd assumed Giselle had. Yulia stood up, and as she approached Melissa, she warned the girl not to call out her name so carelessly. Melissa was taken aback by her cold voice, and she worried what mistake she'd made. She reminded Yulia that they'd always treated each other like sisters, and so it confounded her, this sudden change in Yulia. Yulia imagined smacking the girl hard enough to send her tumbling to the ground, and she'd lay out the truths before the conniving wench. She'd order the nanny to throw out her belongings and to rip off the dress she'd given the backstabbing swine. And Melissa would crawl like the insect she was, tears of regret dripping down her face as she begged for forgiveness. A voice once again pulled her from her pleasant thoughts, and instead of the deserving smack she'd wanted to give, she patted Melissa gently as she explained that Melissa was no longer a child, and while she was forgiving, many people wouldn't approve of her lack of etiquette. She hugged Melissa lightly as she said softly, "I only say this for your sake. You understand, right?" And Melissa smiled happily, basking in the doting behavior of her lady. But what Melissa failed to see was the devilish smirk on Yulia's face, for our heroine had a plan, you see. She couldn't just let Melissa go so easily. No, she would pay them back the pain and misery she felt, tenfold. Just as she would destroy Giselle Mordo as well. They would wish for death once she was done with them. She wore a dress that matched the color of her eyes, that glistened like that of rubies. Her necklace of clear-cut diamonds adorned her neck, and with her thick, long silvery hair, Yulia was a sight to behold. Melissa approached her with a smile and a little jewelry box, and inside, it contained a thick bracelet encrusted with a ruby. It was a bracelet she'd always worn. Within the Rapier family, an ancient legend had been passed down through the many generations. It spoke of the empire that was founded with the aid of the Red Dragon. And the Rapier family just so happened to be the descendants of that very dragon. The members of the Rapier family were born with an inherently strong magical power. And because of this, the Mage Tower had always sought to possess members of the Rapier family. And Yulia stood out, for she possessed an exceptionally strong mana since she was a little girl. In fact, her mana was so overwhelming that many, upon witnessing her power, grew fearful of her. Her father in particular had experienced her power, and so from a young age, he'd labeled her as a monster. Because of this, Yulia had suppressed her power with a sealing bracelet. That is, until now, and so she ordered that the bracelet be put away since it was no longer needed. She decided to become the very monster they feared. And not long after that, Giselle gazed upon Yulia with a deep blush. Never before had he seen her look so splendid. He laid a kiss atop her hand as he complimented her beauty, but her only answer was that of a small smile. However, her thoughts were not as they appeared to be on the surface, for she glared at the audacious man. She knew that they assumed her to be none the wiser in regards to their plan and past actions, and soon she would have them crawling like the vermin they were. But for now, she slipped on her poised mask, for she had a part to play. She smiled at Giselle as she thanked him for his kind words. And soon she brought up the swordsmanship tournament for the Academy's graduation exam, and his face brightened at the mention of it. Giselle had only been able to attend this academy because of the support from Yulia. Usually, it was quite difficult for low-ranking nobles like himself to gain admission due to the high tuition fees and selection process. He hugged her and said happily that while winning was sure to be tough, he'd do his best for her sake. Melissa spoke up as she noted that Giselle was sure to be exhausted from his travels, so they should let him get settled in. He grinned, looking forward to his time alone with Melissa, but Yulia's voice drew their attention as she told them that Giselle would not be staying at the Rapier residence tonight, but at an inn. He looked at her sharply, as her words took him by surprise. She explained that her father had decided that Giselle could no longer stay at the Rapier estate as he believed that noble women not yet engaged formally shouldn't be involved in any situations that could later lead to potential disgrace. While she'd made all this up, it was not untrue that her father was wary of Giselle, given his origins, and despite her pleas, he'd refused to approve her engagement to Giselle, which in hindsight was a blessing in disguise. For emphasis, her face was the picture of dismay as she apologized to Giselle as she promised to convince her father. He smiled as he accepted her reasoning and agreed to stay at an inn, and she offered to have Melissa stay at the inn as well to attend to Giselle as an apology for the change in accommodations. He glanced at Melissa, a knowing smile on his face, excited at the thought of being alone with her as he thanked Yulia. This exchange didn't go unnoticed by Yulia as she glared at the man. And later that night, Yulia sat quietly as the arrival of a man was announced. Beryl Circa from the Circa family bowed deeply in greeting. She smiled at the man as she stated that, to her knowledge, he was Giselle's first opponent in the tournament, and she was also aware that Beryl had agreed to lose the match for a large sum of money. The man gasped as his eyes rounded in shock, and he quickly stuttered out an excuse, but she shushed him as she explained that she'd not called him for punishment. In fact, she would give 5 times the promised amount in return for one of her requests. The day of the swordsmanship competition arrived, and a man sighed deeply after dismissing the soldiers on duty. He looked to the man who sat on the chair, the Emperor, and he wondered why the Emperor had rushed off to the swordsmanship competition. Karstein von Beloit was a man with strong features, dark blonde hair and amethyst-colored eyes, that to match with his clear, fair skin and broad frame made for a high-in-demand bachelor. He'd come to the swordsmanship competition in hopes of avoiding Her Royal Highness, Princess Versina. The reason was quite ghastly, as the royal family had made it a point to continue their pure bloodline by in-house breeding, and he'd made it a habit of avoiding her. The Emperor wanted no part of such revolting customs, and he'd much rather spend his pastime watching sparring of the academic students. And on the other side of the amphitheater, Melissa argued with the man, trying her best to gain access to the Ullin class, reserved for nobles, and even though she had a ticket, the man refused as he stated that she was of common birth. So she was to sit in the Landran class for commoners as was deemed by law. Yulia called out her name, interrupting her attempt to bribe the man. She apologized to Melissa as she'd not realized the seating arrangement and promised to reserve the best seat in Landran for Melissa. Melissa conceded with a frown and walked away, extremely unhappy. And so Yulia turned away, now free to move forward with her plans. And a while later, Beryl fussed over Yulia as she dressed in combat armor. He worried they would get caught since her participating in his stead was cheating, but she smiled as she assured him that they wouldn't get caught as long as she wore the ring on her hand. She explained that the ring was made by her cousin, a mage. Filled with enough mana, the ring allowed her to change her appearance at will. And a moment later Beryl found himself looking at the splitting image of himself, and he stared astonished for a moment before he continued his fussing as she picked up a sword. He worried she would get hurt, but as she walked to the exit, she said confidently, "You don't have to worry because I would never lose to a fake." She entered the arena, and the sound of cheering bombarded her senses. Giselle stepped into the arena, and he waved at the crowd. They took their positions, and Giselle smiled, confident about the fixed match. Yulia, on the other hand, grew more infuriated with each passing minute as she stared at Giselle because for all her support, and yet he'd chosen such dirty means to win a match. Giselle charged forward as the match started and his sword clashed with Yulia's, but she smiled, for she was no amateur in swordsmanship. She pushed back with her monstrous strength, and with one strike, Giselle's sword split in half. The match had come to a close before it could even begin. She'd trained with a sword from a young age with her father as her instructor, as he'd wanted to make sure she'd always had a means to protect herself. Baffled, Giselle shouted obscenities, but quickly stopped himself lest he make it known he'd rigged the match. And with one last look of disappointment, Yulia left the arena. The Emperor's aide wondered how the man had broken the sword when he appeared quite slim, but the Emperor said aloud that it could have only been through the use of mana. He ordered Luzin to bring the winner of the fourth match to him, and he grinned, sure he'd finally found what he'd been looking for, his red dragon. She'd changed out of the armor, and as she cleaned herself, Beryl enthusiastically praised both her strength and skills with a sword, but she thanked him half-heartedly, for her mind was already occupied with the next steps of her plan. The swordsmanship competition was very important to nobles, as this was a way to showcase the results of their education. And despite the support given to him, Giselle had lost in the first round, which would now cause his reputation to plummet. A voice called out to Beryl and stated that he was to present himself before the Emperor. This news caught the attention of Yulia, and she anxiously wondered the reason for this summons. The Emperor lounged back in his seat as he observed the frightened man in front of him. And after a moment, he assured Beryl that he needn't fear, for he'd only called him to commend him on his exceptional swordsmanship skills. Beryl bowed in thanks and soon left at the Emperor's command. Karstein ordered Luzin to follow Beryl and question him, as he believed Beryl had a stand-in for his match. He smiled slyly as he stated that they should receive punishment for mocking the sacred swordsmanship competition of such a prestigious academy. And soon, many nobles gossiped about Giselle, as he'd lost in the first round of the swordsmanship competition. They laughed that despite having the backing of such an esteemed family, he'd still mucked it up, and they were sure that Lady Rapier was quite dejected at the news. But contrary to the gossip, Yulia felt elated that her plan had gone well. Such rumors spread like wildfire in high society, and soon many more rumors would suffocate Giselle. Slowly he would lose everything, and when she was all he had, she would abandon him. Some time later, Baron Mordo greeted Yulia with a pleasant smile. The Baron, Giselle's father, ran a merchant guild that monopolized grenades in the market. He'd taken advantage of Giselle's relationship with her, and she'd turned a blind eye as he'd secured much profit from illegal trades. But she would no longer do so. She inquired about Giselle's health as she'd heard he'd been severely injured, and the Baron smiled uneasy as he apologized for his son's incompetence. The Baron told her that he couldn't attend the banquet due to the severity of his wounds, but Yulia knew that to be a lie. Giselle had been too ashamed to show his face and therefore stayed away under the guise of being gravely wounded. But the Baron soon moved their conversation to business as he questioned if she'd had any inside information, as he'd been thinking about investing in a new endeavor. Yulia smiled as she told the Baron that Duke Christopher had taken an interest in flowers, tulips in particular, as they symbolized the grace of the imperial family. She stated that these flowers had gained popularity among the high-ranking nobles, so much so that they had become quite scarce. She'd even heard rumors that nobles gambled with the valuable flower. The Baron was surprised to hear this and looked thoroughly convinced by Yulia. Yulia, of course, hadn't given away the entirety of the truth because, while the price for the flowers had risen several times, Duke Christopher was a fickle man that changed his mind on a whim. Therefore, he would soon lose interest in the flower. And the Baron was too reliant on Yulia to do any research himself, and that would be his downfall. Back at the Rapier mansion, Melissa gasped in awe as Yulia stated that she would introduce her to a well-mannered gentleman as she was of marriageable age. Yulia sighed sadly as she told Melissa that it had always weighed on her that she couldn't do anything for Melissa, who'd longed to become a noble. She caressed Melissa's cheek fondly as she said with a smile that she wouldn't force Melissa, but nonetheless Yulia would be grateful if she considered meeting the man. She explained that the man was from a noble family, and Melissa's eyes took on an unnatural gleam at the mention of his background. Melissa hugged Yulia tightly in thanks, and Yulia smirked at Melissa's greed, for she'd discarded Giselle quite easily. The day of her meeting arrived, and Yulia smiled as she complimented Melissa on her beauty. Despite her conniving tendencies, she looked every bit the noble lady in a beautiful dress with scattered pink roses, which had been gifted to her by Yulia. And after giving her thanks, she departed with a wave of her hand. Yulia then ordered Smith, her butler, to gather all the tulips from the greenhouse and to deliver them to the market. He was to sell them at half the market price. Her instructions baffled the butler, and she gave one more order. She smiled wickedly as she stated he was to sell the flowers to the Mordo family at the going market rate. She spent some time of the day analyzing the accounts sent from the Mordo Trading Company, and she discovered that the distribution records sent to them differed from the actual records. She wondered just where all the money borrowed under the Rapier name had gone, and so she decided to follow up with the many investors. A knock on the door drew her attention, and Smith informed Yulia that the Marquis had returned. She entered the main hall to give her greetings, and upon seeing her, he pulled her into a tight hug, greeting her enthusiastically. Yulia found his familial touch to be uncomfortable considering the period she'd been neglected by him, but nonetheless, she bared it for a moment longer before she removed herself from his embrace, as she wondered aloud about his early return from the palace. Her father hesitated for a moment before he suggested discussing some matters over dinner. And soon, Yulia almost choked on her food at the Marquis words, for he'd stated that the Emperor requested for her personally. He briefly explained that the Emperor wanted her to be his official partner, as the Emperor had been receiving many marriage proposals as of late. And so, to avoid pressure from his vassals, he'd called upon the Marquis. Yulia couldn't help but wonder if her participation in the swordsmanship competition and the Emperor's summons were nothing but a coincidence, and anxiety gnawed at her stomach. The Marquis made it clear that Yulia had the option to refuse, and she thought for a moment. Beryl Circa had already moved abroad, and she could use this opportunity to provoke Giselle. And so she informed her father that she would meet with the Emperor, as refusing would put them in a precarious position. The Marquis noted that Yulia hadn't mentioned Giselle for some time, and she explained that she'd been reconsidering her relationship with the man lately. She noted that with the gossip mill running amok with rumors about Giselle, she wondered if he'd make for a good husband. She expected a scolding or more questions, but the Marquis simply stated, "Well then, do as you see fit." His blasé statement surprised Yulia, and at her questioning gaze, he explained that she wouldn't make rash decisions on a whim, and his words displayed the trust he put in her. She sighed, relieved that her father hadn't asked many questions, as she'd not wanted to cause the Marquis unnecessary worry. And once she'd succeeded in her revenge, only then would she give the Marquis an explanation. That is, until she'd met the Emperor, and his words almost shocked her out of her skin. It all began with the Emperor, who'd sat under the pavilion, and he'd smiled happily in greeting upon the arrival of Yulia and his aide Luzin, who'd escorted her. She took a seat across from the Emperor, and she gazed at him wary as tea was served. He'd thanked her for accepting his invitation, and she bowed demurely. His voice possessed a note of mischievousness as he stated his surprise at her acceptance of his invitation. As to his knowledge, she'd had a lover she was devoted to. At her look of surprise, the Emperor smiled as he stated that it was common knowledge in high society, and he wondered about her lover's thoughts on their meeting. She glanced away nervously as she stated that her personal matters were of no importance. But the emperor changed tactics, and his next question stunned Yulia as he asked, "How much did you pay Beryl Circa?" Yulia played oblivious to his unmentioned accusation, but it was all for naught, as the emperor stated that he knew everything. And so he explained that what he wanted was simple, and that was for her to bring to him the one that had wielded the power of the red dragon. His request confounded Yulia, and as she gazed at this man who'd sat with a dangerous glint in his eyes, she wondered just how much he knew. She knew now that Beryl hadn't shared much information about her, and for that she felt relieved. Yulia stated that would be impossible since the person the emperor sought had already moved abroad. But the emperor said that she could just request for that person to return, but Yulia politely refused, as she stated it was a man she'd not had distinctly fond feelings for and the trouble it would bring to her doorstep to be further involved with said person. The emperor rose from his seat as he stated the only choice he had left. With a beaming smile, he said, "I have no choice but to propose to you," words that left Yulia flabbergasted once again. Yulia graciously refused once again, and the emperor sighed, disappointed at the rejection as he had expected to come out victorious. And his self-assured voice irked Yulia, and she questioned why he'd assumed she'd readily accept his offer for marriage. And with a smirk, he stated, "I'm handsome and wealthy." He'd said it with an unconcealed conceitedness, which left Yulia speechless. He told her that those were the only options she had, and if she refused, he would have no choice but to inform the Marquis that she'd manipulated the swordsmanship tournament of a noble academy. His playful tone infuriated Yulia, and she trembled with the urge to knock this petty emperor into his grave. Their meeting had ended there, and she'd made it home, barely alive. And while contemplating a way out of the sticky situation, Giselle's arrival was announced. He greeted her with a hug, and she asked about his health. He smiled in embarrassment as he'd mentioned his lost match at the tournament, but she brushed his worries off with a poised smile. He noted Melissa's absence, and Yulia explained that she'd gone out to meet someone. She smiled as she stated that she'd introduced Melissa to a gentleman who she'd thought would suit Melissa perfectly. At her words, Giselle's eyes darkened in fury. As they strolled along the wharf, Melissa thanked James for an amazing evening. She smiled as she wondered if she could always be this happy, but her eyes lost their sparkle as she looked away, noting that she had nothing of value to give back in return. James clasped her hand as he told her that he'd pay anything so long as he got to witness her beautiful smile. He smiled as he said the words she'd longed to hear. "I love you, Melissa," James said as he spoke more intimately. They hugged each other, and Melissa enjoyed his warmth. She smiled happily, for when she was with James, her heart felt full, and she'd hoped moments like this would last forever. But their moment was soon shattered as Giselle appeared, and he ripped Melissa out of James' arms. Giselle grabbed James by the collar as rage erupted from him, and Melissa did her best to stop him. Off in the distance, Yulia watched the commotion, her red eyes filled with satisfaction as this was only the beginning. Melissa and Giselle had returned to the inn, and it was there that Giselle unleashed his fury on Melissa as he questioned why she'd been in another man's embrace, but Melissa claimed it to be nothing but a misunderstanding. Giselle was not so easily fooled, for he knew well of Melissa's dream to be a noble. She explained that she couldn't refuse as Lady Yulia had set up the meeting between them, but Giselle believed that to be nothing but an excuse. They argued, and all the while, from a ledge of the window, Yulia watched their interaction through the eyes of a crow, which reflected clearly in her crystal ball. The man sat on the sofa, and he complained as he wondered just how much longer she would watch such a spectacle, and she laughed at his clear annoyance. She noted his peeved expression, and she wondered if he'd not enjoyed his time out with Melissa. His appearance melted away to reveal the man's true identity, Zen, Yulia's cousin. He expressed his displeasure at having to play a part in her ridiculous plan, and she quickly apologized. Zen was the Magic Tower's senior mage, and he was Yulia's one and only relative that she relied on to aid in her revenge. He was also the mage that had gifted her the magical ring, and now he assisted her in her plan for revenge. Recently, he'd been her teacher in the art of magic, and today they'd be applying the theory of healing magic, which had been taught previously. Her reason for learning magic was simple. Because her body was overflowing with mana, she'd wanted to use it more efficiently. And as she practiced on some tulips, Zen asked about her plan regarding the emperor. She explained that she'd go along with the emperor's plan for now, and looking at the tulips, an idea came to Yulia. She smiled, ready to play her hand. She requested an audience with the emperor the next day, to which the emperor found surprising, and she smiled as she stated that she would do as the emperor wished, but on one condition. She stated that she wanted the emperor to impose a heavy law on the sale of tulips, which had become quite popular in high society recently. But he wanted to know her reasons before he agreed, and she explained that he had no choice but to agree to her terms because, if not, she would see to it that the emperor would never meet the wielder of the power of the red dragon. Karstein's eyes widened at the threat, but soon smiled as he granted her this request, but not before he gave a condition of his own. He approached her and took her by her hand as he stated, as I've stated before, become my partner officially, and Yulia was once again taken aback by his words.